Hey, what's up everyone? Hope you're all having a great day. So, everyone's been talking a lot about the recently announced self-healing passive for tank and damage heroes. But in my opinion, the other major announcement, namely the changes to healing and damage output, have much larger implications for the game. We don't know enough yet to say for sure, but my prediction is that contrary to what most people are saying, I don't think the self-healing passive is going to affect the game all that much. A lot of players are concerned about how self-healing could potentially make certain heroes overpowered. But given that it's supposed to be a weaker version of the already not very strong support passive, my prediction is that it's not going to be all that useful most of the time. The support passive is useful specifically for supports, because supports are capable of doing quite a lot without necessarily interacting with enemies. For example, healing while hiding behind cover. This allows them to take advantage of the passive despite its slow healing rate, because they can continue doing stuff without exposing themselves to damage. In contrast, tank and damage heroes don't really have the same luxury of being able to get value while hiding, and therefore in combination with the fact that the passive is going to be even weaker, I don't think it's going to have a very large impact on the flow of the game. On the other hand, I think the changes to healing and damage, and in particular burst healing and damage, are going to have very significant implications on how the game is played and the overall meta. That's not to say that it's guaranteed to be implemented well, but for better or for worse, it will most likely change the game quite significantly if it's attempted to any reasonable degree. For pretty much all of Overwatch 2 so far, healing and general survivability, alongside the prevalence of burst damage or one-shots, have been blamed as being some of the game's core issues in regards to game design. It in some ways is similar to the criticisms of the double shield meta of Overwatch 1, where it feels very difficult to do anything meaningful, and therefore makes the game feel very tedious. Especially with Overwatch 2, I think the game itself and the community is moving away from the idea that supports are supposed to healbot and just be a mobile health pack for their teammates. I think at some point in the life of Overwatch, supports were indeed intended to be primarily healing-focused heroes, where the idea was that they would keep their team alive, and so to make the role feel a bit better to play, the developers have continuously added more ways for supports to do that, by increasing healing output and adding new abilities to save teammates. While I don't dispute that in some ways the role of supports is certainly to keep their team healthy, I think we might have gone too far with that idea. To illustrate just how far healing creep has come, Mercy, who's now known for having one of the weaker healing outputs in the game, used to have the highest healing output out of all the supports back in the earlier days of Overwatch. The goal of broad healing and damage nerfs would essentially be to lengthen the amount of time it takes for things in general to happen, but simultaneously lower the threshold for things that happen to actually matter. This in some ways would slow the game down, but it could also make things a bit more interesting, because teamfights aren't just won and lost instantly, and at the same time don't get stuck in endless stalemates. You've probably experienced moments in the game where it feels like nobody is dying, and neither team is really making progress in the teamfight. This situation can occur when both teams play supports with very high healing outputs and/or immortality abilities. You can probably think of heroes like Lifeweaver, Ana, or even Baptiste or Kiriko. These kind of supports make it very difficult for the opposing team to build any kind of advantage, and if both teams play them, then teamfights can feel like they get stuck, especially if the map geometry doesn't facilitate the ability to get very creative with playmaking. A potentially questionable hero design that happens to greatly exacerbate this issue is that the supports who happen to have very strong healing outputs also happen to be some of the safest supports to play, meaning that they themselves are very difficult to actually kill. On paper, there's more sources of damage than there are sources of healing, but the reason that healing appears to win in the tug of war is that healing is easier to maintain than damage. While trying to do damage, you will often also take damage, and therefore need to take cover, which means you can't deal damage 100% of the time. In contrast, if you want to, you can basically healbot behind cover the entire game. Healing has a higher uptime than damage does, and therefore, even though there is more damage than healing, you need that damage to occur all at once, which is something that is difficult to coordinate if your team is composed of a bunch of random people. As a result, the meta favors heroes with the ability to do a lot of damage in a very short amount of time. In particular, heroes like Widowmaker and Sojourn are popular at higher levels for this reason. Once players get better at surviving themselves, the healing problem becomes even more apparent, and so you need to have some way of killing someone before the support gets a chance to save them. I think a good way to describe why these are issues is that they contradict with what the game is fundamentally supposed to be. Now, undoubtedly, everyone is going to have different opinions on specifics and details, but I think in general, Overwatch gameplay centers a lot around the concept of teamfighting, which naturally involves opposing teams cycling and trading resources for an extended period of time. This contrasts with most other FPSs, which emphasize very strongly just simply outshooting your opponents. That's not to say that other FPSs don't have strategy or that Overwatch isn't about shooting people, but no other FPS has teamfights like Overwatch, and in terms of gameplay, Overwatch is in some ways more similar to MOBAs than to FPSs. Overly strong healing and burst damage, in my opinion, doesn't match the concept of a teamfight, and I think in a lot of ways it's one of the major reasons that Overwatch 2, despite in my opinion still being one of the most fun games of all time, is in a state where the game feels kind of wrong. Healing is one of the main reasons that Overwatch works, but when it's too strong, it makes the game feel slow and one-dimensional. It slows down the pace because it naturally negates things that progress the teamfight. Teamfights get stuck in stalemates, where both the supports are just throwing out so much healing that nothing significant really happens. Smaller plays don't really matter, and you constantly feel like you have to make some big play, like a one-shot, in order to do anything useful. As a consequence, it makes the game very one-dimensional because it centers the entire game very heavily around one role. The most optimal target in a teamfight is almost always either the enemy supports or the enemy that's currently targeting your supports because you have to save them. This is the case because healing is so strong, you almost have to kill the enemy supports first in order to make any meaningful progress, and you have to somehow make sure your supports don't die, because if they do, you will almost certainly lose. This not only makes the game very narrow, it also significantly limits how you can design the game in other areas. Getting an enemy to 1 HP on paper sounds like you did a lot, but in practice, if you can't get the final blow, it's often barely an inconvenience to the enemy team, because everything you did to accomplish that can be negated in less than a second. Shooting a pocketed target basically does negative damage, and you can often even see the enemy's health bar going up, even if you're shooting them non-stop. Of course, I'm not saying that it should be easy to kill pocketed targets, and if you can't win games, it of course is still a skill issue. But as stated by many people, it creates a situation in which burst damage, or just DPS output in general, needs to be very strong in order to make a non-support hero viable, and in order to allow teamfights to have any chance of progressing. But balancing the game this way just leads to another issue that again contradicts with the philosophy of teamfighting. In my opinion, teamfighting is supposed to be about trading resources strategically with the goal of coming out on top over time. But with the prevalence of one-shots and burst damage, it conflicts with this concept. The value of good resource management and positioning is diminished when there's just too many things that can kill you instantly. When every stat goes up except for health, either nothing interesting is happening or you're just dead before you can even react. That's not to say that resources aren't still important and relevant, but it's overshadowed by the nature of all or nothing abilities. By nerfing healing across the board, it firstly reduces the need to balance the game around crazy burst damage, and secondly allows slower heroes to be more viable. It prevents teamfights from getting stuck and gives an opportunity for smaller plays to make a difference. This more greatly emphasizes key components of strategy such as positioning, resource management, and target priority because large mistakes can't just be negated continuously. In addition, it potentially makes immortality abilities less annoying and problematic if it's easier to force them out. It won't make the game any easier or harder to play since both teams get the same nerfs, but it just makes the game feel less tedious to play and as a result, potentially more fun and engaging. In addition, this change doesn't just affect tank and damage heroes. I think it also makes the support role more interesting, especially for less experienced support players. The support not healer slogan is repeated quite often these days, but when healing is too strong, it's difficult to justify doing anything else other than healing if you know you don't really have the skill to do any meaningful damage. Most players know that the optimal way to play supports is by doing a mix of damage and healing, but because the skill to value ratio of heal botting is so high, many less experienced support players feel like they have to do it in order to maximize their value given their skill level. By lowering the strength of healing, naturally heal botting doesn't achieve the same kind of value, and maybe supports can finally stop feeling like their only job is healing, and similarly their teammates can stop believing that the only job of a support is to pocket them the entire game. Even the less experienced support players will have to start contributing damage in order to contribute value. Combined with the fact that the enemy supports will also have less healing, doing even a little bit of poke damage here and there will feel more justifiable. I think another potentially positive effect of reducing healing output is that it makes support compositions more flexible, at least for solo queue. As long as supports with very high healing outputs exist, less healing-oriented supports, for example pairings like Lucio Zenyatta, are just disproportionately more difficult to play in the disorganized context of solo queue. You can of course attempt to play around it, but given similar skill levels on both teams, you almost have to play at least one support with strong healing output in order to make a solo queue team work, and this restricts the viability of certain compositions. It's obviously not impossible to win without a main healer, but playing without one is just making things harder than they otherwise would have to be. I think reducing the healing output of certain supports could potentially make it less of a disadvantage to play so-called utility-oriented support compositions, better facilitating the support not healer mentality that both the devs and the community seem to be leaning into. Of course, having said all that, we still can't be too optimistic too soon, because these changes could very well still be implemented poorly even if the intention is good. The ratio and balance between healing and damage has a very significant impact on how the game ends up playing, and could very easily be tipped too far in the opposite direction. Many tanks, for example, rely quite heavily on a lot of healing in order to enable them, at least in the current format of the game. In theory, the reduction in damage should even things out, preventing them from exploding, but if the healing to damage ratio isn't quite right, we could very well see tanks becoming an even worse experience to play. As of right now, we just don't know enough about the changes to make any solid conclusions, so we'll have to wait and see what the devs come up with. Overall, I'm excited to see the bigger changes coming in Season 9, and I think it's good to shake things up every once in a while in order to keep things fresh. That's all I have to say for now. Let me know what you think about the healing and damage changes. If you made it this far, I want to thank you for watching, and if you enjoyed the video, consider subscribing and leaving a like and comment to support the channel. And with that, I hope you have a wonderful day.